Hey, In2Picklers, welcome to episode 16 of our podcast, Pickleball Therapy, a podcast dedicated to your pickleball improvement. We try and bring you information to help you become the best pickleball player you can be. We took last week off. We had family in town, birthdays, all kinds of stuff going on, so a little bit slammed. So back at it this week. What we're going to work on now is we're going to get into a series about pickleball paddles. We get a lot of questions about paddles. Players are concerned about paddles, paddle selection. Am I playing at the right paddle? What we're going to do is we're going to start getting into some different concepts having to do with paddles. In this episode, we're going to focus on the sweet spot. Getting a lot of questions about the sweet spot. We're going to hit that in this episode. Stay tuned. Every week, players ask Lori or me about the In2Pickle Academy. They want to know more about our online courses and what they're about. If you're interested in knowing more about the In2Pickle Academy, you can visit In2Pickle.com and you'll be able to link to a video that explains the In2Pickle Academy. Or better yet, join us for one of our free 30-minute workshops. During the workshop, you'll learn a thing or two and learn about the Academy. See you in class. Before we get into the sweet spot of a paddle, what the sweet spot of a pickleball paddle is, we first need to have an understanding or an agreement of what we're talking about when we use the term sweet spot. Sweet spot has different terms in different contexts, so I want to clarify it or talk about the way that I'm going to be using it in this context. In tennis, the sweet spot is deemed to be the place on the racket where the ball will leave with the most energy, and it also transmits the least vibration to your arm. So it's the sweet spot. It's a sweet area where you hit the ball there, and it just feels good coming off of the tennis racket, and the ball's going to travel farther. It's going to be a better hit by hitting the sweet spot. What's interesting is there's some material out there that you can read that suggests that sweet spot is a tennis concept, at least for rackets, because the tennis rackets have strings. So once you move away from strings, like to a pickleball paddle, some would suggest that there is no sweet spot on something like this, simply because it's a hard object that doesn't have strings. I would disagree with that, but there is some material out there that suggests that if you don't have strings on the racket, it doesn't have a sweet spot. Other sports use the term differently. In baseball, the sweet spot is the point where you hit the ball and it launches off the bat at between 8 and 32 degrees. That's how Major League Baseball talks about the sweet spot. So it's not so much of a feel thing on the bat. It's more of the best spot to hit the ball, so you get the best kind of a shot off of the ball leaving the bat. In golf, it's where the ball bounces on the iron and where the metal flexes the most. It's usually right in the middle, but it's where the metal flexes the most, and where it's going to give you the most pop on the shot if you execute the shot at the sweet spot of the golf club. I think the most productive way to use the term sweet spot for pickleball is to talk about the area of the paddle where you hit the ball and it feels the best. So it's the area of the paddle where you're going to hit the ball and it's going to feel the least harsh on your arm, so the least feedback to your arm. And it's also going to be the spot where you have the most control over your shot. So basically, if you hit the ball in what we'll call the sweet spot, you're going to have the best, the truest shot come off your pickleball paddle. That's what I'm going to use as the sweet spot when we talk about it in pickleball. Let's say you were to hit the ball on the corner of the paddle. So if you hit the ball on the corner of the paddle, you're going to expect the paddle to turn in your arm, to have some torsion in your arm. And so what will happen is, that clearly wouldn't be the sweet spot if you hit it up in one of the corners of the paddle or in the bottom corners of the paddle. That's not going to be a sweet spot, because that's going to, it's going to give you some feedback to your arm that you're not going to want. And B, it's not going to give you the truest type of shot coming off the paddle, as opposed to if you were hitting it in the middle of the paddle. Now, if you compare those corners shots to the middle of the paddle, the square center of the paddle, then you'd expect that the center of the paddle, or hitting the ball in the center of the paddle, is going to give you a better feel than hitting it on the corner of the paddle. And that's one way of thinking of the sweet spot. Usually on a pickleball paddle, the sweet spot's not going to be exactly in the middle of the paddle, and that's because of the way the paddle is constructed. You can't look at it as the middle of the face of the paddle because of the fact that you're holding the grip of the paddle and swinging it. Usually the sweet spot's going to be a little bit higher than the square center of the paddle. So if you were to start here and move up a little bit, your sweet spot on a paddle is usually going to be somewhere around here, a little bit above the center of the paddle. When you hit the ball, that's where it's going to feel the best. That's where you're going to generate the most power, impart the most energy in a sort of a sound way, as opposed to hitting it on the tip here. And on the tip, you technically have more energy because it's farther away from your hand, so it has more torque or more energy being delivered to the ball. But it's going to feel better, and you're going to have more control somewhere around here-ish. So this spot here is more likely than not on your paddle is going to be the sweetest spot on your paddle. And if you hit the ball here, you're going to feel a difference. Recently, I got a question about sweet spot asking me if there was a paddle that had a sweet spot all over it. And then there was one of the replies was that there's a paddle company out there that's advertising its paddles as having a sweet spot all over the paddle. I would suggest that that's simply not possible. I haven't tested this paddle, so I can't say definitively, but just objectively, it would be fair to suggest that on the edges of the paddle are not going to feel the same, or hitting on the edge of the paddle is not going to feel the same as hitting in the center of the paddle or a little bit higher from the center of the paddle. So, a paddle that says that it has a sweet spot everywhere just conceptually doesn't make sense. And I would suggest that if that's what's being told to you, that you ask some additional questions about how that's possible, given just basic physics and how materials work. You'd like to help your friend or family member learn how to play pickleball, but how? Now it's easy. Pick up a copy of Play Pickleball, A Beginner's Guide. It's the most complete guide to playing pickleball. Available as a digital download or in hard copy at In2Pickle.com or at Amazon. Let's keep growing the sport. Another question we were asked was whether you could enlarge or move the sweet spot on a paddle. I'll link to a video that we did on the applying lead tape to a paddle. It's about paddle optimization. And in that video, we show you how to apply lead tape to a paddle and different concepts on lead tape and all that. What I want to talk about in this video about the sweet spot is that if you applied lead tape at the top of the paddle or on the corners, which is what we advocate in the other video on paddle optimization, what will happen is you will move the sweet spot a little bit towards the top, and then you will also open it a little bit or expand it a little bit. And the reason you expand it is, as I mentioned earlier, if I hit the ball on the very corner of the paddle, so right on the corner of the paddle, I'm going to apply maximum torque to my arm. So I'm going to basically, the paddle's going to want to move in my hand the farthest away from the middle. So in the middle, it doesn't really want to move too much. On the corners, it starts to flex out. So if I say I came in like 2 inches from the corner and press there, it's going to want to flex out there too. But if I had lead tape on the corners to counteract that torsion or that torque, then what happens is it makes the paddle more stable and opens up the sweet spot by making the area that's not disagreeable or that won't cause torsion or torque to be a little bit larger. If you watch our video on paddle selection, you'll know that one of the key components of paddle selection is playability. And playability means, how does the paddle feel to you? How does the paddle feel in your hand when you hit a ball? How does it play for you? I mean, just what's the feedback? All those sorts of things. It's a touchy-feely thing. But really, at the end of the day, the most important thing of any paddle isn't the face material or the core material or edge, no edge, whatever. The most important factor of a paddle is, how does it feel when you play with it? Does it give you good feedback when you play with it? Does it hit the ball the way you expect it to or want it to? All those sorts of things factor in. Sweet spot is one of those characteristics that goes into playability. So basically, sweet spot, if you think about it, is part and parcel of playability. If you hit with the paddle and say you have no feedback, and there's several paddles that I've tried that I cannot feel the ball come off the paddle, so I have no feel for the ball. In those cases, it's not that the paddle necessarily has no sweet spot. It's that my arm or my body doesn't correlate or doesn't resonate with this paddle. So whatever sweet spot it has, I don't feel. There's other paddles like this one, for instance, where when I hit the ball, I can feel the feedback from the ball. I feel the ball's interaction with the paddle in a positive way, meaning I can feel whether it's soft, hard, coming off the way I want it to, things like that. And so that's what we talk about when we talk about sweet spot. Really, at the end of the day, is how does the ball come off the paddle when it's in your hand, and how does it feel for you? What I would suggest is, rather than getting caught up on specific metrics about sweet spot, size of sweet spot and things like that, is try the paddle out. Hit with the paddle. If you like the way the paddle feels, and you hit it, in different areas and it feels pretty good, generally speaking, then that paddle has a good sweet spot and is suited to your game. If you play with a paddle and it feels harsh, it has feedback to your arm that just isn't agreeable to you, or you don't like, or you can't feel the ball come off the paddle, or the way you want it to, then that paddle, regardless of sweet spot or no sweet spot or things like that, is not the right paddle for you. You can find more information about paddles, different paddle ideas, paddle concepts, about weight, paddle selection, and things like that in our paddle playlist, which I'll link to. You can also go to our website, In2Pickle.com, and download our paddle guide and some other paddle information. Thanks for joining us for this week's podcast. Hope you enjoyed it. If you enjoyed it, share it with your friends. If you liked it, they probably will too. Join us next week. We're going to continue the paddle series. We'll keep on looking at different aspects of paddles, helping to give you more information so that you can pick the right pickleball paddle for you. Good luck out there.